I've been very, very blessed because I got used to having these kinds of conversations with Africans who have these kinds of conversations. It's very strange that Westerners are, in many ways, bragging that they're the champions of free speech or champions of rigorous intellectual debates, etc. And yet I've had very, very, very interesting chats in the middle of Africa that I would never be able to have had here in Australia, just because the sensitivity that you've just described is so heightened, and that we've sunk into a bit of a cultural depression where people mistake heated conversation with the personal attack. There is not a joviality about this topic here that exists where I used to live, and with the people that first brought me into orthodoxy. So we have had a completely different exposure. I have not had the Purana environment that you've had to deal with academically.
I will say the Puranas tend to be on the outside, because those of us in the tank are practiced at, I don't know, jousting. I'm not sure, right? It's like the Purana. It's like there's a Purana level of the intensity of our intellectual engagement at Chicago. You know, the opposite side, I think it sounds more like what you're experiencing in Africa. You know that it's okay because it's what you do. Right. You know that you have these difficult conversations and people stare at you and say, I disagree with you. And you stare back and say, yeah, I disagree with you.
Which is fine. For a large population of people, the word Judeo-Christian doesn't exist. This term that is used in the West to describe the relationship between Judaism and Christianity and the effect on the culture, this term is not used in Africa. Judeo-Christianity, in the cultures where the origins of a lot of the stories are from, the biblical stories, they don't use this term. They have a very, very different way of describing the relationship between people that are following either faith. First sort of difficult baptism of fire into this subject that I had was with a Black Jew who came from a family that had historically practiced the same Judaism as the Falasha from Ethiopia, the Beta Israel, which they call Haymanot. His family had later converted to Islam for whatever reason, to assimilate politically or because they actually had a legitimate religious conversion, I'm not sure. This gentleman had absolutely no hang-ups about talking about his family history. There were a few other similarities between the two of us, this being one of them, that we have had the memory of distant relatives that are in a different religious persuasion to us. And he was also a great lover of Greek culture. So we bonded over this shared, love of Greece and all things Hellenic. But he was explaining to me that he and his family had this experience, that this is not rare, that it is in fact quite common in that part of the world to find families which are aware of their Hebraic roots and yet have become Islamified. And so they have a very different relationship to conversion than maybe some people do in different parts of Europe. Because of this kind of conversion experience, they also had a very interesting take on the relationship between Christians and Jews and Hebrews that were in different faiths. For them, they could make a very clear storyline that connected them to the Israelite story, regardless of the faith that they're currently practicing now. And I found that really striking. I found it really beautiful also that there was not this need to deny heritage, where that kind of opened up the conversation to how did you guys actually get here in the first place. So when this man in particular and the other people that I was talking to were explaining the kind of cultural cartography and how heavily influenced it was by the African Jewish diaspora, that this is really only documented through oral history, I was very, very shocked. And then I had to, keep digging and keep talking to people and look at, okay, well, hold on a second. They're only making religious distinctions here. They're not making racial distinctions.
Right, which is a big one for a lot of Americans and Europeans around Judaism.
Yes.
Some of which my colleague David has written about, because he's written a lot about what happens in the 15th century and the arguments that develop in Spain over blood, the purity of the blood, limpieza de sangre. And yes, and so, but what you're saying is that kind of argument doesn't develop in Africa?
In the particular area that I was in, they did not have this issue with what I like to call racial fractions. It was never an issue of blood purity. It was an issue of conversion and practice of true faith. The people there were more concerned with the expression of religion than they were their ethnic heritage. The reason why it was so strange for me in the beginning was because these were Muslims. So it's not like having a discussion about the conversos in Portugal or Spain, where there's been a bit of an argument over a forced conversion and whether or not we're still Jews in blood, Christians, but we're still Jews. And no, the people I was talking to, they were very unfazed by having Hebrew heritage and yet being Islamic without there being any contradiction whatsoever. It was a different environment. There were no racial fractions. So that sort of set up the beginning for me to start to look at, okay, well, what areas did you come from? Where have you been scattered up until the point where you've been, living here for several generations and you now have an Arabized name, Solomon becomes Suleimani and this kind of integration happens. This then puts me in the problem of Judeo-Christian versus what I would call a Solomonic identity more than a Judeo-Christian one.
The fundamental misunderstanding of what we say when we say we're a Christian nation, I think in part because, and we're showing now Charlton Heston with his speaking to the cars, right? The Rembrandt's version of showing the tablets, that we have been talking about ourselves in these terms, right? We're a Christian, no, we're a Judeo-Christian nation since the mid 20th century, particularly after World War II, and particularly, it's like the Ten Commandments. Ten Commandments as a movie is very interesting because it's so reverent in so many ways, but you can feel it coming out of this moment when specifically the political conversation is using Judeo-Christian as its marker for what we in the West are as against those godless communists. And I was reading deeply this week in Peter Novick's Holocaust in American Life book, and he has a very interesting footnote to a great article by Mark Silk, who I think I've met him in person. I know him as a great scholar of American Protestantism. And he did this article in the 1980s talking about, one, how Judeo-Christian was falling out of favor. It wasn't really a term that people liked anymore. And I'm like, what? Clearly the 80s are back with us, and not just in the music that they have in Guardians of the Galaxy, right? The heyday of the term Judeo-Christian is specifically as a political weapon against Soviet atheism, against communism. And so I think people who invoke it now invoke it in the same breath as saying America. You showed me an interesting article, and I went and looked up one of the things that it suggested.
Oh, the ABC one.
Yeah, this ABC one. And one of the things it does is go to Google Ngrams and find out when exactly Judeo-Christian actually appears as a term. And I think the author of that article, he went and looked at the Google Ngram and said, look, if you search back, and he did it from 1800, you don't find any use of Judeo-Christian from 1800 up to around the 1940s, right? And then it goes up in the late 1940s, drops back down, goes way up later. Well, the thing is, if you expand Google Ngram to go all the way back to the beginning of the English archive, you don't get it anywhere there either. As a term, it's completely tied to this political usage from the mid-20th century. And Professor Almond, in this ABC article, because he's talking about Australia and whether or not Australia should be using this term, points out,
yes,
there's problems with it on all sides, right? Because it's, in the context of the longer history that David talks about of the anti-Judaism, it's in the context of, this is a curious one. Christians actually, it's philo-Semitic in the sense that you love the Semitic people, but you pray for their conversion from Judaism, which is therefore still anti-Jewish, because you're saying, faith in Christ is necessary. And he concludes with saying, we shouldn't be using this term at all, which fits more with what Mark Silk was saying they were trying to do in the 80s. And this was a good passage that Almond wrote. At the end of the day, or the end of the world for that matter, the term Judeo-Christian is one we might well do to abandon. It conceals the Western history of anti-Judaism. Even when in philo-Semitic mode it appears to extol the virtue of Jewish identity, it is deeply anti-Judaic. Simply put, then, there is no such thing as the Judeo-Christian tradition. It is a modern invention. There always has been a Jewish tradition and a Christian tradition, or more accurately, varieties of Jewish and Christian traditions. I don't know. The plural game is one that my colleagues in the divinity school do a lot in Christianity, or Christianities. But anyway, are we Christianities, or are you and I different? The term Judeo-Christian tradition continues the suppression of Jewishness by hiding the essential differences between Judaism and Christianity, one of which is that each denies the validity of the other, which I think is very fair. As Rabbi Eliezer Berkovitz puts it, quote, Judaism is Judaism because it rejects Christianity, and Christianity is Christianity because it rejects Judaism. The problem is that it's two sides of the same coin, right? And when you start playing the all religions teach the same thing, and aren't they monotheistic, and therefore they really basically have this one minor little disagreement, a trinity. Or are they, completely separate traditions? Or are they, developed in? But anyway, what struck me when you talk about the Coptic tradition and the conversations you've had is that even those lines aren't quite as clearly drawn.
No, and I think this is because in the African world, they are, this is a gross generalization, but I have to do it for the sake of this conversation sometimes. There is a memory of the interactions between the Abrahamic faiths that is different, that is talked about differently than how they're discussed in the Western world. One of the most important things that I could use to highlight this is in Islamic religion and in the story of the Hajj. The Muslims, they leave Saudi and they go into Ethiopia to get refuge under the Christian Negus of Ethiopia because they're being persecuted back home in Arabia. And they have to famously answer the questions of the Negus of Ethiopia, the king. Negus is king, and explain their theology and explain their opinion of Christ and his mother. And after they explain their reverence for the mother of the Lord, they're allowed to stay. So they're given refugee status in Ethiopia. Now, this is a huge event in the Islamic world. To imagine that Westerners don't understand the importance of this event is kind of mind-blowing, because without this happening, there would be no Islam. There would be no Islamic community. The Ummah, the Islamic, annihilated. So it was our relationship to the Muslims of Arabia that formed the beginning of this dynamic between the Islamic world and the Christian world. And it happened in Coptic Ethiopia, which is why we have a similarity in prayer practice, because, as our tradition teaches, we taught them how to pray in the way that we do with prostration.
Proskinesis.
Yeah. So there's this. So there's this kind of relationship. So these are the things that are talked about that are not really discussed very much in the Western world. But when it comes to the distinction between Judaism and Christianity, in the context of Coptic Ethiopia, it is a very, very different conversation, because Ethiopian Copts reference the New Testament story of the conversion of the Black Hebrew by Philip the Eunuch as their genesis, as the beginning of their realization of Christ as Messiah of the Israelites. So in this way, because they're celebrating what happened in the book of Acts as the fulfillment of the very long waiting period of the Hebrews in exile in Africa for the Messiah, received the message of the eunuch and integrated this story into the mythology of them as Israel waiting for this news. And they haven't discarded the Israelite identity in adopting Christianity. It wasn't an either or choice. For them, it was, we are Black Jews, we are Black Israel, we are Black Hebrews. They don't even use the word Black. I mean, this is an American term.
Right.
For them, we are Israelites, Beta Israel, House of Israel. We are the House of Israel in exile, and now our Messiah has come. And so we're receiving it. So the expression of the faith is not referred to in this contrast between Judaism and Christianity. It is that now our Israelitish religion has been fulfilled with the messianic gospel, with the good news of the Savior, the good news of the Master Rabbi of Israel having incarnated. And so the expression of the Christian faith in this part of the world is much more Semitic than in other areas. It's much more rooted in Hebrew and Israelite practices than you would see in many other places. And it does look very foreign for modern people to look at it from the outside, because it is so ancient.
I mean, one of the things that David does in his book shows that, that the New Testament itself is anti-Jewish, anti-Judaic. That Paul, in his letters, identifies the Jews as the ones who are unable to see Christ properly, and that the Gospels, particularly John's very blunt in its naming of the Jews, so that they are the opposition to Jesus is the Jews. Presumably, you all read the same texts. David, to his credit, has always been against the kind of slippery slope to the Holocaust argument in our scholarship, so that particularly in his first book, in Communities of Violence, he tries to show in the Middle Ages that there's no necessary end point in the Holocaust in these persecution narratives. But on the other hand, it's very hard for those in the West to see it as any other way. right? It's like no matter what, from the Gospel of John to Auschwitz, straight line.
No.
Really?
So, no.
How dare you?